Tonight we are climaxing our series on African collaboration and African unity. My guest, I have the Queen of the African Union that's in the diaspora, Royal Highness Queen Lukwesa Morin.
Hello, everybody. Very honored to be with you all and discuss these important topics.
Thank you so much. Next is retired Professor Dr. Holmes. Doc, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
How are you? And thank you very much for inviting me.
Great. And Dr. Holmes is a retired professor of African Study and also political science.
Right.
And from Virginia State, am I correct?
Right, Virginia State University in Virginia.
Great. So welcome. And we are glad to have you. And to all our viewers on Facebook and elsewhere, this is, we are climaxing for the past 5 weeks. We've been discussing African unity, African collaboration, what we as African immigrants in the diaspora can do together to impact our communities here and also impact our countries back in Africa. We have spoken with people from Nigeria, from Liberia, Sierra Leone, Uganda. And so we are climaxing. So we have the Queen of the African Union, that's Ms. Lukwesa Morin, originally, or her parents from Zambia and also France. So she's a Queen of the African Union, and I will let Morin talk a little bit about her role and also give us some highlights about the African Union and how she became Queen. Morin, let me start with you to introduce yourself a little more to our viewers.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lukwesa Morin. I am the first ever Miss African Union 2019. In terms of my background, I have a master's in public policy and public administration from Johns Hopkins University. And I actually did quite a bit of international development work, both with the World Bank as an environmental consultant and with the United Nations World Food Program. And so I've actually had firsthand knowledge of mitigation as well as disaster risk management frameworks as it pertains to Lesotho, which is a natural disaster-stricken country. And very much like Lesotho, I realized that there was a common pattern with a lot of different other African countries and nations in regards to not having a foundation or framework on how to deal with issues, and not just disaster related, but social issues, economic issues, political issues. And I became very fired up, so to speak, and really wanting to have a career that was focused on tackling those issues, especially because my mother, as the host mentioned, is Zambian. So these issues are very dear to my heart, and that is that's basically what compelled me to compete in the Miss African Union pageant, which I did win in December of 2018. And so since then, our focus has been on the AU mandate, which is Agenda 2063. It's creating a sustainable framework in Africa that is African focused. So a lot of times when people think of Africa, they think of, what they see on TV or what society's construct is of it, poor, aid need, they need aid from other countries or other international organizations. But I think what the key missing point is that rather than focusing on how much we can obtain monetarily or how much help we can get from other countries, I believe the mindset of African leaders, as well as children, needs to be more so geared inward. How can we grow from the inside out? How can we consume as well as purchase goods and have that come back into the community? So like in a cyclical pattern. And just as an example, if you look at the Jewish community, a lot of these markets, a lot of the businesses, they're passed down from generation to generation. So you don't get a lot of the outside influence infiltrating a system that's already robust and a system that continues to propagate. But in Africa, you get a lot of help or assistance or needs from other places. So there is no cycle, so to speak, that is coming back into Africa. Everything is just going out. And so just as a brief overview, that has been my focus with the AU, is how to engage African entrepreneurship, how to give back into African-owned businesses, how to connect with youth that are desperate for change and, you know, they need a voice. A lot of times you see people in parliament or people in political positions, but it's the older generation. So there's a gap in how youth, people of my generation, the millennials and even younger, how they're able to use their voices to affect change by connecting with the older generations and older leaderships. So there's a gap in that. And then there's also a gap in the African diaspora and then people in Africa and how the dialogue surrounding African issues needs to be established, because there's a lot of miscommunication in regards to what's important, what's not, you know, how are we going to deal with this versus does this need to be dealt with? So the biggest issue is the lack of coherence among all of the things that I mentioned.
Wow, thank you so much. And Dr. Neil Holmes, we invited him because he knows a lot about Africa and the connection between African diaspora and the continent. So Dr. Holmes, first of all, just, I introduced you briefly, but if you can say a little more and then comment on what Lukwesa just said has whole role in how you see the AU and Africa in general.
Well, just in terms of a little about myself, I have a PhD in political science from University of Cincinnati, where I also have a master's in community planning. And I also have a background, undergraduate background is in social work. So I'm sort of a social science, applied social science kind of guy. Politically, I've been involved, I'm a Pan-Africanist, and in particular, follow the perspectives of people like Kwame Nkrumah, who's really my hero. And I've been an active Pan-Africanist since the early 70s. When I was a kid, my father, when he was in high school, well, when he was a kid, there was no high school for Blacks in our county. So he had to go to a boarding school, St. Paul's College. And that particular boarding school had a number of Liberians there, had some Shermans and so forth. And he used to tell me about some of those positive experiences. So early on, I had a positive view on the continent. I think that's kind of important. As our sister was just pointing out, sometimes we have these images that aren't correct in terms of what Africa is or what African Americans are. And we have to somehow clean those images up. And we also have to come up with practical ways of communicating and unifying ourselves from the ground up, not just from the inside out, but also from the bottom up as well. And I think that's very important because and we have to think in the political sense of how do we get rid of these boundaries, because right now we have many of our countries are economically not viable because they don't have the population base for for a viable economy. So we have to think about a number of these issues, and no issue should be considered to be too difficult to attain.
Thank you, Professor Holmes. And if you just joining us, this is Focus on Liberia. We are continuing or climaxing our discussion on African collaboration, African unity. My guest, the Miss African Union, Miss Lukwesa Morin, and Dr. Neil Holmes. So we are discussing this, and we're going to delve more into the issues of Africa and what we can do as people in the diaspora to impact. And we're going to be looking also at the relationship between African immigrants and African Americans. There has been a divide. How do we bridge that? What are the root causes? And we're going to still talk more on what Africa can do to help that. So we'll be posting the numbers shortly so that you can join the discussion. and contribute. So Morin, Lukwesa, let me come back to you on the AU. And there have been some issues. First of all, let's go back to what the AU is supposed to be doing and what has been its role in the diaspora, how the former ambassador of the AU have been trying to work with people in the diaspora so as to impact Africa. What has been the work there and what your role and focus has been in that direction? Lukwesa?
Pretty much. Hi, so that's a great question. And it's pretty much been twofold. In terms of my role specifically, as I mentioned, the gap between African Americans as well as African immigrants. We're also focused on intra-African trade because going back to my point about how there is no sense of solidarity between African countries, there is no kind of cyclical pattern of money going in and out of the economy and then back in again. Everything is kind of going outwards where Africans are buying from either European-owned businesses or American-owned businesses, but there's no internal framework. And so with the intra-African trade concept, that is essentially getting countries to trade with one another. So if Zambia is known for a certain product or mineral, or Cote d'Ivoire has certain natural resources that are beneficial, and then they need to trade with each other. And while that's obvious, it doesn't occur, and it's at the detriment of the entire continent because you're not getting the full benefit of Africans trading with Africans and being unified economically, but rather resources are now being extracted out of certain African countries and used for technology here in the States. An example is the iPhone. So our initiative has been to basically unify the diaspora here in America and get them involved with the African immigrants as well as the goal and the mission of people in Africa. Because one of the biggest issues that I've seen is that there's not a care for African issues. So that people always say, at least I've heard some people say, Black Americans are so different from Black Africans. It's different mindsets, different upbringing, different family traditions. And I like to kind of challenge that in the sense that we all come from the same motherland, and that idea of your issue is not my issue is not, in my view, politically, economically, or even morally sound. So that has been my role, is focusing on intra-African trade. So I have been communicating with embassies like the Moroccan embassy, as well as the Ethiopian, to kind of set precedent and focus on businesses that are owned by Africans, attending economic forum summit meetings so that businesses can meet with entrepreneurship and investments can be made by people who do impact investing. And so that's been my main focus. And the issues with the former ambassador, that has kind of, I don't want to say derailed, but it's kind of put things on hold. So I haven't been able to do much of what it is I really wanted to do in terms of going out to different countries and promoting community service projects. So for now, I've just been churning out ideas and agenda schedules and plans to propose to the AU, because as far as I'm aware, there's not going to be another AU pageant this year. So I've just been in communication in regards to how we can solve those issues and have a different kind of leadership for the next year.
I think you preempted my question, because what I was coming to as to what the challenges have been and what have been some success stories concerning your role and what you've been doing. So basically, things are on hold as it stands.
Correct. I know I was able to go out to, I was able to visit Addis Ababa in February for the AU summit and meet with some of the heads of state. I met with FIFA leaders, which was a great time to kind of discuss ideas potentially. So in the future, I could potentially join with FIFA, the soccer team, to promote African unity. And but for now it has been on hold because of the recent occurrences.
But how have you been connecting with other African immigrant countries right here in the United States?
So I've been so in terms of connecting with different embassies, like I mentioned, the Moroccan embassy and Ethiopian, there are ambassadors here. Met with the ambassador of Zambia, who's located in the States. We have been working on community projects pertaining to like poverty alleviation, because that's what I'm passionate about is reducing poverty, but as well as creating different food programs so that in times of disaster or in times of abject poverty, people as well as the community have resources to go to. But in terms of funding, that's been the biggest problem in being able to actually do these initiatives. So it's just been discussions about what can be done until that framework is set up by the AU.
Dr. Holmes, how did we get here? African Union, OAU, African Union, now these challenges.
I'm telling you, just
Yeah.
when you think you've seen it all, right?
Yeah. So give us a little idea how we come to this point. Now the AU ambassador, as I learned, she was doing so well. She's been terminated and all these kind of issue. What's your take on how we got to this point?
So what I'll say is that
Dr. Holmes. I want Dr. Holmes to come in.
Oh,
yeah.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. I thought that was directed at me. Absolutely.
Yeah. He has seen a lot, so he goes way back.
No, I love his perspective already. I'm anxious to see what he has to say.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a long struggle, a very long struggle. I mean, from this end, we had Pan-Africanism for us was really the first and oldest political tradition within the African community in the U.S. or within the African American community, because Paul Cuffey, who was from Connecticut, and the name Cuffey suggests that he was from what we now call Ghana, and his mother was Native American Indian. His father was from Africa. He and his brother built a boat with their hands, built a ship, and took 38 African Americans to Sierra Leone, and their families still stay in contact. They have wings of their family on this side and wings of their family in West Africa. And they're still there, and they still communicate back and forth. Now, I mentioned that this is the first political tendency because Paul Cuffey was also the first African American to sue for the right to vote, successfully sue for the right to vote in this country. So this was the first from this side. And we had many of attempts, and some of these people are not as well known as others because they left here and they moved to West Africa. Alexander Crummell, for instance, was the leading intellectual and Pan-Africanist or Black nationalist or whatever, and moved to Liberia. The first African-American to put together a newspaper also left the country and moved to Liberia. So over time, we lost contact with some of these people or their histories. Also, we had people, there's a gentleman from West Africa by the name of, he was called Chief Alfred Sam. It wasn't his real name, but that's the name he used. And he was involved in trying to get African Americans to leave here and go back home and to help build. So these have been developed, and these attempts have been ongoing for some time. And not just in the United States. If you look at Lagos in Nigeria, those are people who left Brazil and went back home to Nigeria. You not only have a free town in West Africa and Sierra Leone, but you have a free town in Kenya, where Africans who have been involved in enslaved in India and in some of the Arabian trade were able to get back home to Kenya. So these things have been going on for some time. The AU is an outgrowth of the OAU, and which Nkrumah and people like Sekou Touré and others were champions of, and it itself was sort of a compromise body, because people who wanted to go to the whole full force to immediate unity, political unity, and those people who resisted and wanted more of a regional economic unity were able to compromise on this question of the OAU. And also the OAU provided resources to help in the rest of the colonization in Southern Africa and Guinea-Bissau. So, and they provided weaponry and other resources for that. Then later we have, that wasn't really doing what it should do. It did some great things. Leaders came together and they were able to hash out issues and problems and so forth. And they were able to go to the UN and have an African voting bloc that was the largest voting bloc in the UN. And at one time it was quite effective. And in fact, for African Americans, one of the reasons that we were able to achieve some of the things we achieved is because African leadership at the time took a very hard position with the United States and saying, you have to treat our brothers and sisters better, or we might have to think about going with the Soviet Union, because you guys don't look like you. If you can't treat these Black folks correctly, how can we expect you to treat us correctly? So much of what was attained in the civil rights movement owes itself to pressures coming from Africans on the continent. It is particularly in the form of OAU and the Africa bloc at the UN. And more recently, there was a push, especially from people like Colonel Gaddafi, and also Gaddafi was influenced to some degree by a gentleman by the name of Kwame Ture. We used to know him as Stokely Carmichael, who was spent quite a bit of time in Libya, and was pushing this idea of a unified Africa. So again, for Gaddafi's idea, you had to have a unified currency or a single currency. You had to have a single government and so forth. And this was the move that got us to where we are now. The toppling of the Libyan government and the assassination of Gaddafi has had some impact on these things, but we have to keep going forward. And Nkrumah tells us he says forward ever, backwards never. So there are going to be all kinds of difficulties. Yeah. So much of our leadership, our best leadership, was assassinated by the West and by their lackeys on the continent. You think about people like Patrice Lumumba, the overthrow of the government in Ghana, and we talk about the youth in South Africa. So so many people. Robert Sobukwe, Mandela, of course, was in prison for all those years, and so we had if that leadership, that early 60s, 70s leadership, had been able to live and survive, along with people like Malcolm X, of course, and Martin Luther King, we would have seen we would have been at a different stage. Yeah. But in this period, it's not going to be the big individual leader that's going to make it happen. It's going to be the generation of youth, and some of us old timers who still can, still got a little, who's going to make this thing happen. Yeah. When we did the Black Lives Matters movement here, you had young people in Nigeria, had young people in South Africa. You had young people going to the U.S. Embassy and saying, why are you killing our brothers and sisters in the streets in America? Yeah. That had a huge impact. That had a tremendous impact. So I'm talking more from the political side. Our sister's talking from the economic side, and we'll meet somewhere in the middle and get this job done.
Yeah.
One thing that I would like to see, that I think, before I forget, because I'm old, I have to put these things out there while they're still on my head. You know, this idea of building the green wall and planting those trees across the Sahel to keep the Sahara from encroaching further, I think is a marvelous idea. I was in Burkina Faso in the 80s, and Sankara was still there. We worked on a tree planting project, and that was a person who was way ahead of his time, or who was in his time, but unfortunately wasn't able to stay with us long enough. Yeah. But that's something, I think those are the kinds of projects, practical projects, that I think you can engage young people, children in the diaspora. We had a project. I used to work with the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker organization. And they had a project some years ago where we had young kids in the ghetto living in housing projects who were participating, help raise funds and so forth to get mine sweepers, those mine, those things to help get the mines out of Angola, because there was so many more mines at that time were in Angola than any place in the world, and people were still getting blown up, from the struggle in the 70s and 60s and so forth. And so something like I think you can mobilize young people around the question of putting a tree in Africa, putting a tree on the Sahel. And I think in terms of the economic piece, I used to go, you mentioned the Jewish community. I used to work in an area where there were a number of Jewish real estate men. And inevitably, when I would go in their office, they would have on the wall the first Israeli bond that they'd ever bought. And what if we had an Africa bond all over the, and sold it all over the diaspora? You're not going to get a huge return from it, but it's the idea that you're buying into this bond that's going to be a development bond that's going to be used to build factories. Yeah. In other economic institutions. So I think there are a lot of practical things that can be done that are easy to do. Mao Zedong said the way you change the world is to make things easy and simple, easy to understand and simple to carry out. So something like, hey, let's raise money for a tree in Africa. And how many trees can our community do, along with the current efforts? I think that's doable, and some other things, and the people themselves will come up with practical stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And Lukwesa, I want you to feel free to jump in and ask Dr. Holmes a question. If you want him to explain on anything more, so that we make this, a discussion, if you will. So feel free anytime. If you even want to ask me a question or ask Dr. Holmes a question, please feel free. But my question to you is, you step in a road that is completely new. And because of this, they are not, because you have practically no one had done this before. So you are in a very known territory. Where are you getting some ideas from as to help with or carry out what you need to do?
That's a wonderful question. So in terms of kind of keeping on the dialogue and maintaining the discourse on African issues, I have friends here in the diaspora who I communicate with. I was just actually in New York City a few months ago to attend the summit on basically best practices for development, and actually met the AU Youth Envoy there, as well as different ministers of finance, agriculture. And so just keeping that dialogue open and just going to these different events. And this event was at UN headquarters. just discussing best practices on development in Africa, what hasn't worked in the past, and what could potentially work going forward. And so you keep up to date and current on streamlined issues, whether it's youth and what their frustration is. And their frustration is that they felt their voices weren't being held accountable or taken seriously by the older generation of leaders who are not really familiar with the digital age or social media. As you see, even now, technology is playing a part in the development of Africa. So while I may be focused on the economic aspect, I'm also aware of the finer, or I guess the broader mechanics at play here. You know, it's technology, social media. If more of these initiatives were being communicated and discussed, and if more youth were participating, you'd have Twitter pages, you know, blowing up by the dozens. Everyone would know that Africa is not just going to, and again, I'm just speaking about this in metaphors, but Africa, if it were a person, is not just going to sit there and allow their country and or their continent to be to just lay barren, you know. And there's so many resources, there's so much intelligence, all the youth have so much capability. It's just not being utilized, you know, in its highest proficiency. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the disconnect between this modern day technology, how things are being communicated. A lot of the older generation are not allowing, again, this is just from their perspective that I was able to have the privilege of hearing while I was at the event at the UN office. And so that aspect of it, as well as the political aspect, you have a lot of leaders in their positions, but, and I'm trying to think of a very diplomatic way to state this without coming across as if I'm sort of criticizing African leadership, because I'm not, but you do have a lot of, again, history will tell you this, you do have a lot of leaders that are not in their positions for the right reasons. And so I think that really hurts morale, not just on the political front, but for youth that want to see these changes, and as well as for everybody else that is fighting for the same thing. You kind of get taken back by the issues you see when you see scandals about political leaders or people taking bribes, or people just not following a code of ethics when it comes to implementing change. And I think that also needs to be addressed, because we're always talking about, hey, what can we do different, or what doesn't work? Hey, let's talk about the people who are at the top making these decisions. I think that really needs to be addressed. And there needs to be a lot more transparency for that to occur.
Dr. Holmes?
Yeah, I had a question for Sister Lukwesa. I have two questions. I'm one of those old fuddy-duddy non-technical people, but why is it, I mean, are there some things that the youth can do technology-wise without these folks? I mean, you know, independently. I was talking to a sister one day, and she's into hip hop, and she was saying that there are some hip hop artists in Africa on the in East Africa and West Africa, and they communicate online, and they actually write music online. They collaborate online. They don't have to be in the same studio. They can actually be 3,000, 4,000 miles apart and turn out really some powerful music. So are there some things, I mean, do you have to wait around for us to die off, or can you really just, can you get started without those folks sitting on top of you? Is there some things that can be done without those folks?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's why this movement has been much more about youth participation as well, because it's not that the older generation are not technologically savvy, or they don't know how to use things. It's that there's a better, I don't want to say better, but there's a deeper understanding of the power of that. Millennials are growing up on these devices, are growing up on understanding the ways that social media breaks the internet or creates that sense of urgency versus, creating a proposal or agenda and having it be sent through so many bureaucratic systems before it's actually amended or seen before someone who can, amend the decision or approve it. So I think it's just the sense of urgency that needs to be shared with the older generation in terms of how to push this so that it's at the forefront of everyone's mind, so that it's on every news outlet, so that it's on every laptop, computer, so that people are more aware of these issues as they come up, as opposed to dealing with the issues in the background, having a lot of issues and then or having a lot of delays with those issues, and then things kind of just being delayed in terms of outcomes. So just to get back to your question, what I've seen on Twitter or even on Instagram accounts with African community or aid, there is a lot of conversation and dialogue being shared, and the AU, the other contestants, Guinea, Uganda runner-up, they also do a lot within their schools and their communities to raise awareness. And so youth, I feel the youth are doing their best to get the message across, but in terms of real solid power and influence, that I feel like a lot of that is still housed within. If they could come together, I think it would just be much more powerful effect.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Holmes, you said you had another question.
Yeah, I had one other question for her as well. Now, as a young person growing up in the diaspora, you grew up in the diaspora, right? And with the connection to Zambia and so forth, what was that like? I was reading this article. It's an article in the Economist, October 19th, and it's discussing the fact that the largest, fastest growing community in the United States from outside the United States is the African community. In 1970, there was something like 80,000 foreign-born Africans here, and now we're like close to 2.5 million, and it was the most rapidly growing. We think the Donald Trump administration is going to try to stop that quite a bit. But what are some of the issues that we have to work with from your experience in terms of both negative and positive?
It's a very good question. So I grew up in Georgia. I'm in the DC area now, but I grew up in Marietta, Georgia. So I had a lot of exposure, like the Martin Luther King dialogue. His memory was definitely cemented in the minds of people who grew up in Georgia and as well as all over the world. But since his house was there, he's very much seen as a role model for Black youth. And so in terms of the negative and positive with the diaspora, earlier you had mentioned how there are these societal notions that the media puts forth of Africa as a certain way, and how damaging it is to the minds of people who have never been to Africa or don't know, aren't close with an African. They create these preconceived notions about what they're like or who they are, and their mannerisms towards people. And I think that not only affects non-Africans and non-Black Americans, but it actually affects people in the diaspora as well. So I think the divide is not even just on creating change and ways to change it, but it's in regards to how people are viewing each other, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like how do you come together to fight an issue that's global when at the local level you're regarding your friend or your brother or your sister as an enemy? And so I think that that permeates, especially like we've seen the Black on Black violence amongst people in the streets and people killing each other. I think that is a disease of that that thought process, the ideology that's passed down, that we are not better than what we can be, or that our potential is somehow not existent because of history repeating itself. So I think that there's such a thick issue, but it's just layered. It's layered issues that need to be dissected so that one thing can come together and help another issue get more developed, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it's multifaceted on every level, because you're not just dealing with perception, and we all know perception is reality. You're not just dealing with perceptions, you're dealing with the economic, political, and social kind of decapitation of society. So it's kind of like, how are they expected to get out of that conditioning if there's not a fundamental change in how they communicate with one another? I think that that's the biggest negative aspect that I've seen is their view of each other. It's you can't really come together or build when that fundamental piece of it is broken. And so, yeah, I hope that answered your question. But in terms of the positive aspects, I do believe that now more than ever before, people are tired. People are sick and tired of being sick and tired, as the saying goes. And just to see this over and over again, the media and how Blacks are portrayed, how Africans are portrayed, the violence. You see violence against women, particularly in what's happening in South Africa, with the movement that's been spearheaded as a result of Uwinene's death. Mm-hmm. So and again, that's Black on Black. That's not, a white person or Asian person or an Indian ethnic minority. It's Black on Black. And I feel that really needs to be addressed before we can kind of gather together and say, hey, we're going to take our position in this world and do good.
Thank you. Let me take a caller on the line, and then I will come to you, Dr. Holmes. Caller, your name and where you calling from?
Yeah, this Monu from
Man, welcome to Focus on Liberia. Your question or comment?
Right, thank you. This is a very rewarding program, and I'm really enjoying Dr. Holmes and Ms. Morin as well. But my comment here is that
if you can speak a little louder, please.
Okay, my comment is basically this year I believe is it makes 500 years since the first Africans were brought onto these shores. The Ghanaians had the presence of mind to have what they call sort of a welcoming ceremony for African Americans and those within the diaspora. Liberia, it's unfortunate that Liberia, the country with the closest in terms of history to African Americans, didn't have any programs of that nature. And so I found that, after Liberia, I just found it a bit troubling. There was not even a message from the president of Liberia honoring that. The first five presidents of Liberia were born in the United States. They were from the American South. Another thing, this one is a question for Dr. Holmes. Those of us who have had interest in, Pan-African history, we notice that within the history books, they have this kissing between two Pan-Africanists, Marcus Garvey on one hand and W.E.B. Du Bois. I believe Garvey wanted, professional African Americans to move to Africa. Liberia was his spot, his place of preference. W.E.B. Du Bois said that, well, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Holmes, that after African Americans had invested blood, sweat, and tears, the United States of America was where they belong. So what do you make of this? I mean, is this accurate history? Was there actually bad blood between these two, or is,
Yeah,
is it a situation of his story?
no,
Not our story, but his story.
there really was quite a bit of conflict between these two. And it was a conflict that really shouldn't have existed. Part of it was a conflict. You know that Du Bois had a rough time with a lot of people. He had a hard time with Booker T. Washington. So he was someone who and both Du Bois and Garvey both were people who fought hard for their position. Part of it, I believe, was ethnic issue, as Du Bois was not just from the United States, but he was from, he was a New Englander, and Garvey was from Jamaica. So part of it was that ethnic thing. Now, and part of it had something to do with the politics in Liberia itself. And Du Bois fell down on the side of one group of folks in Liberia, and Garvey fell with another group. Both of them, now Garvey never did get personally to Africa himself, but both of them had a deep love for Africa, and Du Bois had a particular love for Liberia. He said the perfect school, he said if you want to develop, you could not develop a more perfect education than the school, the traditional schools, the traditional Poro societies and Sani societies that he saw in Liberia, because they prepared the total person to be a full member of society. So Du Bois, now Garvey, the Liberians had made a deal with Garvey. They were going to 900,000 acres of land, and he was going to develop that and so forth. And so they had Garvey was a tremendous fundraiser. They had made tremendous fund. They had equipment, all sorts of industrial equipment. But the guy who made that deal was the mayor of Monrovia, and some of his political opponents in Liberia thought he was trying to become president. So one of the worst things that Du Bois ever did in his total life was be used by the United States government in Firestone. It was Du Bois who went to Liberia and said, well, you don't want to get involved with Garvey because he's not good with money and so forth. And, what you want to do with this land is let Liberia give you a loan and lease that land to them for rubber plantations. That's how Firestone actually got there. Yeah. Now, in terms of Ghana versus Liberia, in terms of this, it's actually 400 years since the first African came into the British colonies. We were here before the British colony, but the 400 years for the British colonies. But you see, the Ghanaians have been working on this thing for a long time. Again, we go back to Kwame Nkrumah, and you talk about Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King, Dr. King. He traveled. He was in Ghana during the Independence Day. He came back. You Google that speech. It's called the Birth of a New Nation, I believe, and that's a sermon, not a speech, that he gave after he came back gave in Georgia, in Atlanta, after he came back from Ghana. And in that speech, he said, I'm going to encourage Black folks, or Negroes at the time, he used that term, to go to Ghana in their hundreds and their thousands to help build that new country. When he got back, those days you had to travel, you had to stop for a day or so in England, and then you take your plane back to the States. So he stopped, and he said he stopped and saw all of the sites in England, the Buckingham Palace. And he said that's the old dying system, and he said the new system is in Ghana. So Nkrumah had invited him back for the December conference, where there were going to be like labor unions, youth, all kinds of these mass movement folks from all over Africa. I think but he was involved in some movement stuff himself in the South, so he couldn't go. That is Dr. King. But I think if King had gone to that thing, we would have seen a different history. I think there would have been more emphasis on the African aspect of his movement if he had been able to continue that relationship. But in the 70s, there were certain people in the government, mid-latest 70s, during Rawlins' time. And their idea was that in order to get foreign currency, one way to get foreign currency is to encourage cultural tourism on the part of African Americans. And so they actually began to encourage people to come to Ghana, and professional organizations and others would have meetings in Ghana. Some organizations would meet in Africa every 4 years. And basically that meant they met in Ghana most of the time every 4 years. And you come, you spend a little money and so forth. And that's one way to get that foreign exchange. And that over time has built a more deeper relationship between between some folks. Certainly, Liberia could do the same thing. Liberia's problem is not so much inclination and all of that, but we're still trying to recover from the effects of that civil war, and that's But I think cultural tourism would be one way to help bring in some resources, much needed foreign currency, into the country. That's how countries like Italy developed after the war. They had the Italians who had come to the U.S. and who retired would come back to Italy and retire and spend money, or they'd travel and spend money. It was like the second or third largest source of foreign exchange.
Right.
So this cultural tourism, I think, is something that Liberia really needs to look into. I think there's a lot of ways it could be really done really well.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, we had a show yesterday on tourism on our Business and Economic Forum. We come on every Saturday with that. And we were discussing tourism, and we will discuss that next week. But let me go back to what Lukwesa stated before about the challenges about doing these things in Africa, coming from the leaders and the rest of it. What do you see, Dr. Holmes, where these problems come from? Is our problem Africans now? Because everything that we try to do in the diaspora, that's dependent on people back home to be receptive, to support, and also to encourage diaspora Africans to go back and help. But there has been problems. What is the source of that problem? Is it economic? Is it education? Is it religion? What is it?
Well, from my perspective, the source of the problem is Britain, France, United States in particular, and these countries. And I think this is where really the diaspora can really begin to play a really big role, especially if we look at Black Europe. I mean, I'm not saying especially, but we see more and more young people, especially young people, going to Europe. The Germany and France have very large populations, or large populations, and as these populations become more established, I think Europe in some ways will begin to be more of a leader in the diasporan politics in the way that the African American was sort of a leader in the diasporan politics, because you have so many more people. It's a newer diaspora in a lot of ways, with that direct connection to Africa. And so we now become a balance point. In the next 20, 30 years or so, 40 years maybe, 1 out of every 4 people in the planet will be an African just on the continent. And then we're going to have these large populations inside the United States, inside of Europe, Brazil, 50% Black, if it depends on how you count the people, large populations in Colombia and Venezuela and so forth. So those of us in the global North, we have a really big role to play in order to force these countries to not be so negative. We have to, it has to be part of our politics. and this is going to require to promote that Pan-African thinking. And see, the thing that's really that troubles me is that, you know, in the 60s, there was a time when everybody, you know, had a dashiki, and people were changing their names to all sorts of things. And then all of a sudden, this society is very powerful. It made all of that stuff kind of negative through the use of the media and other things. So at one point we were talking about, if you listen to early hip hop and listen to some of the stuff that people were writing and saying, it was really very pro-African. And then the powers that be began to promote a whole different aesthetic. And this is one of the problems. We have to deal with this corporate domination of our life here and our lives on the continent. So we need a political movement that recognizes ourselves wherever we are as African, and that Africa is the core. Whether you're in Jamaica or Atlanta, or, you know, where you're in Germany someplace, or France, or Brazil, or wherever you are, Iran, you know, because we have a diaspora in the Middle East as well. Wherever you are, India, we have a diaspora there too. Wherever you are, you're working your butt off to make sure that the place that you're in is not oppressing Africa. We tried something in Ohio once. I lived in Akron, Ohio, which is where Firestone used to be based. And we got the rubber workers workers union in Akron was at that time headed up by a brother, by a black man. And we got them very interested in the way that Firestone was treating rubber tappers in Africa, in Liberia, because these rubber tappers working their butts off all day long, carrying that latex and stuff all up and down, and getting $30 a month plus, you know, some rice and some oil. And so we got them to try to be vocal on that issue, and those are the kinds of relationships. I live in where I live in Virginia. Not far from where I live is the headquarters for Alcoa Aluminum. Most of the bauxite in the world is in black countries, aside from that you find in China. So you have bauxite in Ghana, you got bauxite in Guinea, you got bauxite in Jamaica, you have bauxite down in Guyana, and China's trying to buy up a lot of that bauxite now. So you could almost have a cartel, a black bauxite cartel. And those of us who live in places like Pittsburgh, where you have aluminum companies, and Virginia, where you have big aluminum corporations, we should really be making it difficult for those folks to do certain things. Same thing with the cocoa. You know, the cocoa, there's a lot of noise now about the cocoa and cocoa, you know, and the child labor and stuff like that. But the bottom line is the cocoa farmers are getting a bad deal in terms of prices. So you have Mars Candy Bar in Virginia. You have what's those other folks up there in Pennsylvania, Hershey's. We should be putting pressure, huge pressure, on those kinds of places. You know, I think that's where we can do it. You know, and the same thing for those of us who are in Germany, those of us in France. We can become we even up the playing field just a little bit, and we give more running room to our brothers and sisters on the continent, because then they'll know that if America doesn't do the right thing, then there's some black folks who are willing to make things difficult for the Americans. And so forth.
Lukwesa, you heard Dr. Holmes. Is that like making excuse for African leaders, especially when you say, well, let's look at Britain, France, America? How do you look at that, especially from your generation? You kind of spoke holding more and more African leaders accountable. What do you think? We having some video problems there. Dr. Holmes, there's a question here on the while we wait to get Lukwesa on, is that do you support the idea that Pan-Africanism is regarded by some as antithesis to European
Hello, can you hear
imperialism?
me?
Okay, now we can hear you.
You want me to go? Or you want Lukwesa to go?
Good question. And I have a lag. It's like the screen is frozen.
Lukwesa, if you can come on again.
Okay, now it's back on. Sorry about that. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, it's better.
So if you could repeat the question, that would be great.
Right.
You said what I think about the perception of Britain,
Yeah,
United
Dr.
States,
Holmes.
and for Africa.
Yeah, Dr. Holmes was laying the blame primarily on Western nations as to the problem Africa is facing. And I want to hear your perspective on that.
I would agree. So I was coming from different sectors, right? So I mentioned the African leaders needing to be held accountable. I mentioned the kind of the failure for the diaspora and African immigrants to unify in solidarity and understand each other's issues. But I think, and I'm not trying to put words in Dr. Holmes' mouth, but is that he's looking at it from a broader perspective, a bigger scope. Right? It's what is the actual root of all of this?
Mm-hmm.
And I would definitely agree that it has started from scope, all of this. And I would definitely agree that it has started from colonialism and the idea put into the minds of Africans to colonialism and the idea of have the capability to prosper independent of European powers or European influences. So in terms of societal conditioning, he mentioned how the media is very powerful and it's a tool, and then next it's not, because the media demonizes the mental perception. And someone believed in the United States and France that Africans were inferior. These countries needed to be colonized so that they could be used and their resources could be maximized with no regard for the inhabitants. I think that does play a monumental role, because that is the beginning of that ideology that Africans are inferior and can't provide for themselves and can't come together economically. It was the separation of all of these countries during colonialism that that basically prohibited Africans from unifying together or coming up with their own ideas and resources and sort of dreams, even dreams, right? Dreams were smashed during colonialism for a better Africa, because now we're not underneath our own control anymore. We're being controlled by, the external party who is smart, we are not intelligent. We will always be second grade, if that, second class citizens. So I would agree with him that is the crux of everything else we see compounded that's happening right now. I think it's that harmful ideology that's just cemented in the minds of Africans everywhere, African countries, African leaders. It's that idea, and the fact that even in this present day, we are still dealing with the effects of colonialism. Like France, they still own certain reserves in Africa. And so until we can break away from that and truly become independent, I think those issues are always going to be there.
Right. Let me cover two more topics before we close the broadcast tonight. And Dr. Holmes, let me go back to you. There's a group of people now we call, Africans in the diaspora, including, African Americans and other Blacks in Brazil and other places. Let's talk about USA. I know, how did we come to become Africans here? I know it has been through waves. So just briefly describe for us that wave of people coming from Africa here, so that we get a broader perspective on how we got here.
Well, I think we had three basic waves for the African diaspora in the United States. The first wave, of course, being the slave trade, slavery and the slave trade. Those of us who've been here, these 400 years, and we came in some numbers, and what happened was that the United States enslavement process was a little different from what happened in the Caribbean and so forth, in the sense that in Haiti, for instance, you had this the oppression was so intense that the lifespan might only be 7 years. So there was a constant influx of people, and this constant influx of people meant that you were constantly renewing traditional African culture, traditions, religion, and so forth. So you see that stuff is real strong in places like Haiti, Brazil, etc. Because of that. In the U.S., after a while, the population that was born here became larger than the population that was being brought into the country through the so-called slave trade itself. So what that meant was that culture began to it's still an African culture, but it was a little different. It took on a little different character, because it was more or less separated for several hundred years from this influx of folks. So that first African diaspora in the U.S. was those people who came directly via the slave trade into the U.S. and some from the Caribbean. So if you look at South Carolina, people from South Carolina came up from Barbados, so forth. The second wave, excuse me, came right around World War I, after, when you begin to get a large number of folks coming in from primarily from the Caribbean, but also from West Africa, coming into places and see, unlike the first wave, these folks are going directly to the big cities, especially New York, Harlem. And so inside of Harlem, and some other cities, you're having this percolation between African Americans traditionally and some people from the Caribbean and a few Africans from the continent. So this is all creating what people call Harlem Renaissance, although this thing was happening all over the country. And the third wave is what we have now. Since the 70s, Africans coming into the continent from Africa. And here, what's unique about this is that largely this newest diaspora, many of folks are going into new areas. At first, it's going to be have a higher income than African American. It's going to have a higher education larger than African American in average terms, and so you guys you guys go to cold places like Rhode Island and Minnesota. We don't go to those places, man. But so you have something interesting happening, that this some of this third African diaspora is coming into the country, and sometimes it's going to places where the traditional African American population is relatively small. Not always, because you have Atlanta and you have Philadelphia and those places, in Chicago, of course, but and out on the coast. But you have also Minnesota, Rhode Island, and those kind of places where you don't have large African American populations. Now, what happens though is that the process becomes the same. I mean, people are still going to be going to feel racism, and there's going to be people going to get caught up. I mean, if you look at young people on the West Coast coming from East Africa, Ethiopia, so they get caught up in the gangs just like everybody else. Mm. And also we begin to lose our language, just like beyond the third beyond the grandchildren, it's difficult to hold on to the languages sometimes, which is a big problem. So we have to really promote our languages in the public schools and broaden them out, because it's really, that's an important issue as well.
Yeah.
So also the thing that we see is that in a number of cities we have African community organizations that represent the sort of a blending of a number of African people from African countries. We don't see much African American participation in those, and we want to see more African American participation in those. We also think that it's going to be important for those questions that have a particular resonance to Africans. Let's say in Liberia here, you have the question of the TPS and so forth. Donald Trump is trying to kick folks out the country. This is something where these are things that we can work on politically, and we have to get the larger African American community involved with these kind of questions. We need to know about them as well. There's social media would probably be the best way to get the word out. Just say, hey, these are the laws, these are the bills that you really need to work on, and what that means, and in the process do a little Liberian history stuff. We need to visit each other's churches and masjids, because often those operate on national lines and even ethnic lines, and they do in this country. So if you look at a black church, a traditional black church, not these huge churches. If you look at the church I grew up in when I was a kid, basically that church is a group of about 4 or 5 clans that have been working together since the end of the Civil War. And if you look all across the country at a traditional African-American church, that's what you're looking at. Clans that have worked, families, groups of families or clans that have worked together. I have 5 or 6 clans in the church that have worked together closely since the Civil War.
And that's a question, that's an issue I want to come to after I take the 2 more callers. Is that that relationship between African Americans and African immigrants? And so, Lukwesa, will be coming to you first, but first, let me take a caller. Caller, your name and where you calling from?
Yeah, my name is Stanley Sewon. I'm calling from Dallas, Texas.
Stanley, welcome to Focus on Liberia. Your question or comment?
Thank you. But the show is very interesting today.
Thank you.
My question here is that one of the trends that I've noticed is that the United States, when in terms of national security interest, most of the focus is on either the Middle East and not Africa. There has not been a single major U.S. basis on the continent, with the exception of just what they're trying to establish in Djibouti. My question is that what influence that the African Americans here are using in terms of the political, like in the Congress and in the Senate, to persuade those former or previous or upcoming United States leaders to look at Africa from that perspective, rather than just a continent that is so vast, but the major focus is on the Middle East, where the United States is even waiting to go to war if they feel that their interests have been somehow threatened. But the entire continent, with all the resources, with their historical tie as well, is just left like to fend for themselves. So I just want to see what is going on and what can be done to change that trajectory.
Great question. Thank you, Stanley.
I will say, and I'd be interested to hear what Sister Lukwesa has to say on this question as well. But I think that first of all, the United States is deeply involved on the continent, and I don't think it's a good thing. They have something that they call AFRICOM, which is the military group.
I'm so sorry.
That deals with Africa,
and right now, I'm so sorry. I have a Kim at 7:30.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
you want to? Okay.
So is
You
Is there
want
any
to comment?
way I can kind of loop
Yeah.
around getting back to the question?
Can you say that again? I'm not
I'm
getting it.
sorry.
Can you say that
I'm
again?
sorry. It's cutting again. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I have to go to. Is there any way that I could readdress this question, like as a follow to head out right now?
Oh, yeah. And you can also address that, as the question I really want you to address is that relationship African Americans and African immigrants, especially you being growing up here, and what can we do to bridge that?
Right.
If you can address that, then you can you're free to go.
So in terms of bridging, I would say that so the first and foremost is definitely open dialogue among people in the diaspora as well as the African immigrants. And that needs to happen not just in the US, but also in African countries. I think that in terms of dialogue, there needs to be mutual participation in like political spheres, even like government, right? People in government, like an African government. There needs to be a lot of transatlantic, um, sharing and communication in order for everyone to be aware of what issues are going on and how these issues are being impacted and how opposed to the issue kind of making its way through government or politics and then being exposed. I think the social needs to come first and foremost so that everyone's on the same page about what the issue is to begin with. And so from there, we move on to the next page at the start. And then the second thing would be in terms of businesses and even African-owned businesses, even American-owned businesses that are owned by Black Americans. There needs to be that kind of solidarity and, how can we come together, whether it's through fashion, technology, whether it's through the economy, right, in terms of purchases of goods and the production of goods. I think there needs to be an understanding that, in terms of promoting each other, to do better. And, by promoting you, it's also promoting me and people like I come from and my town and my home and my village, wherever your locality is. I think that needs to be strengthened. And I think that from that point, we can start kind of building this solidarity and unifying force that can actually create change, not just in Africa, but in America.
Thank you so much, Lukwesa. Due to other engagement, and Dr. Holmes, you can address the question now.
Yeah, I think that in terms of this question of security, there's United States has this thing called AFRICOM that's all over Africa. It's not just in one or two places in their bases. There's bases in Djibouti, of course, but they're also building their bases in either Niger or Chad has a big drone base. It'll be the very expensive type thing, and they're in almost every African country at some level, about 49 or 50 countries. There's one of the leading generals said that the war of the future is being fought in Africa today. And you have these special forces folks who are carrying out 10 military operations a day on the continent of Africa. It's already there. And even when you talk about the Middle East, much of what the United States considers the Middle East has to do with Africa. So, you know, if you talk about, they call ISIS or ISIL or Daesh or however you call it, they have now bases in, you know, in Nigeria. They're just blew up some stuff in Mali. They've instigated fights between the Dogon and the Fulani. You know, folks have been getting along for hundreds of years. You know, at a basic level, you know, and now all of a sudden people are fighting each other, and so you can't talk about the Middle East in separation from Africa itself. You have young Sudanese, so-called child soldiers, who are fighting in Yemen. You know, so you got, you know, you have this stuff all over the place, and even in the Middle East itself, you know, there's a considerable African population in Oman, in Yemen, and certainly in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq. You have a population in Iran, the south of Iran. So in all of those places, you know, we are being affected by all of this. This entire thing. So I think that you know, I think we don't want the United States to get too security conscious in Africa, because that's not going to be good for Africans themselves. You know, already if you look at the security apparatus that's in Liberia, that makes it more difficult.
Yeah.
You know, here we talk about the special relationship between Liberia and the United States, and here, you know, when people need some help, you have a political leadership and government that wants to kick folks out of the country.
Yeah.
So we have to, I think, kind of rethink how we do this. Now, I want to go back to this question of leadership in Africa itself. And I wasn't trying to get those folks totally off the hook, but I wanted to make the point that one reason that we have so many, it's not a question of individual African leadership. It's a question of something that Nkrumah called neo-colonialism, which is a system. And it's a system where you have outsiders, you know, the imperialists as outsiders, and you have their people who do their bidding inside. And we have the same thing here. We have leaders who are not really good leaders who are not really helping our folks out, who are really working and benefiting, you know, developers and other people who are kicking our people off of land, both urban and rural. So and they're considered leaders. So we have to challenge them. We have to both here and wherever we are, we have to have a better leadership.
Yeah.
But the thing we have to realize is that the bad leaders, the really awful leaders, are all backed up by the British, the French, and especially the United States.
That is correct.
And the good leaders are going to be attacked by those same forces. So when we get a good leadership, we're gonna have to protect them. And that means we're gonna have to have that political relationship in the West by the diaspora, who can say, hands off this good leader.
Yeah. Let me bring in another caller. Caller, your name and where you calling from?
Hey, Dennis, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Hi, Dennis. This is Eastman calling from Washington, D.C. Hello, doctor. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. How you doing?
Good. This topic today, Pan-Africanism, has been around for a minute, and we've seen, especially when Africa was still under large colonial rule, it was popular. The same concepts were discussed. We have to do it on our own. But if we think about it, it boils down to two things. One is economics, which is probably bigger, and the other is politics, right? The economics is, okay, can you can you feed yourself?
Right.
Can you gain life? Can you sustain your family? That's what's in the back of, I mean, everybody's mind. And then the political aspect of it is, do we really have a democracy? I'm talking about Africa now. Do we really support democracies in Africa? You'll see people, their tenures, there's still long tenures of president, and they claim to be of a democracy, but yet you see them in power for 20 years and more. So beside that, we have other things. We are suspect of one another. If you look at this fix has to come from an empirical look at the African himself. What is the African? John Dennis, you can attest right now, if we go back home, and at one point in time it was an ethnic thing, but today, if you go back home, oh, you from the diaspora, you're different. Africans are not open to one another. They suspect of one another. But then you probably wonder, why has the European been able to take advantage of that? In other words, what does the European do, or the Asian today, because China has made a beachhead in Africa today? What are they doing to exploit the Africans that we can't take up the same? You know, and the bottom line is it's economics, and until we can figure out a system, a plan that will address us individually, they will always be able to. They will always come in there and offer something that we can't offer ourselves.
Yeah,
and we fall for it. We fall for it each and every time. And let me just leave this. One friend of mine told me, he was very honest. He was aware of a European persuasion. He said, the problem with Africans is that they want to take the easy way out. It's going to be hard. If we're going to go and really do it on our own, there are going to be some tough times. And are we willing to go through those tough times? So my question to the doctor is, you've seen this happen a lot, and up and down. We had a good leader, which was Martin Luther King. I think he was a visionary. I think we don't have visionaries. So what would you propose now with this insight that Africans have, the empirical look that Africans have to be involved in this new Pan-African movement?
Yeah. Well, I think like everything else, you're going to have some positive aspects and you're going to have some negative aspects. So let's talk about some of the positive aspects, because we've talked about some of the negative aspects. We've talked about the ways we see each other when we meet each other sometimes, and we talked about leadership that isn't what we want it to be, and so forth. But let me talk about a few positive elements that I think are heartening, at least to me. I was at a meeting back in, when was it, in the spring, April, March. I was down in Dover, Delaware, at Delaware State, which is an HBCU, historically Black university. And they had initiated a process in conjunction with the with the AU, with the African Union. And what they did was bring together African American business people and people from the AU, and these were some people who had had some resources, and they talked about some of the things that they wanted to do, and some of the things that the AU wanted to have done. So that was one thing. What also happened at that time was some things happened in terms of agriculture development, which is going to be key. You talk about we have to feed ourselves, and we have fed ourselves for years before slavery and the colonialism came and disrupted our own development. But there was some relationships made between schools of agriculture in the U.S. at the HBCUs and the AU in terms of some some agricultural development processes. So that's one thing I think is a good thing. I used to live in the Philadelphia area, Delaware actually, but I worked in the Philadelphia area. And when I was there, the House of Chiefs in Ghana set up something that they call Fiancre Project. And the Fiancre meant rebuilding the broken house. So the leaders of the House of Chiefs came to the States, and they began the process of helping to build this relationship. And this is another piece of that Ghana African-American relationship. It didn't happen overnight. And, they came over, they met with students, they met with children, they met with business folks, and they established some relationships. And some of those relationships are ongoing on both sides. So, in this area, we had a young man, and I'm sorry, Sister Left, but we have a gentleman here who just got back from Zambia. He found out through that DNA stuff and some other stuff that he originally was from Zambia, went there, and they set up they said, come brother, we set up some negotiations around land, some business things, and I'm waiting to hear his report because he was able to make some things happen. So I think when we have been family members who haven't seen each other for 400 years.
Yeah.
And sometimes the family members that we saw last night, we don't get along with that great. But as such, we're going to do things. We don't always understand what we're doing and what we're saying. So I might say something innocently and somebody might misinterpret. And I might misinterpret something that someone else does. So we have to take time in this process of reuniting ourselves and coming back into relationship with each other, because we shouldn't be in a we should be in a hurry, but we shouldn't be in a hurry. We shouldn't rush this process. We should get to know people. Right. Get to understand people and unite on a human basis.
Yeah. Let me get in my last caller so we can address the issue of relationship between African Americans and African in the diaspora. Caller, your name and where you're calling from, and please be brief. You have 1 minute.
Right. Thank you. Right. Thank you, Mr. Josh. My name is Jerome Cohn. Dr. Neil, thank you very much for your deliberations. We all agree on all the points you and Lukwesa touched, and I took note before this conversation, and one of the most important things Lukwesa touched on was that we have leaders in Africa who are in the positions they are occupying today for the wrong reason. Mm-hmm. And I heard you also talk about Pan-Africanism taking its peak somewhere in the 60s and early 70s, and then nosedive thereafter. My question is, I know you have been interacting with a lot of African institutions as a professor and some African leaders. Do you see anything changing in terms of political will, in terms of the willingness for them to come back to the discussion table of this United States of Africa that is being talked about?
Yes, I do, and I tell you, and really, it's coming from the youth, and who are effectively using that social media that Lukwesa talked about. For instance, if we go to Burkina Faso, we see that Compaoré had to step down because the youth became so powerful.
Goodbye.
And they forced his removal. In a similar sense, we see youth really playing a huge role in places like in Senegal, in South Africa, even while some of this other stuff is going on, we pay a lot of attention to the negative stuff, the people fighting each other, but we also see the youth playing a huge role in trying to make those relationships, better, those relationships with Africans from outside of South Africa. So I think I interacted with some youth from the Congo. We have a young guy who goes into the Congo and so forth, and these youth are very active in the Congo. They are very active around the elections and other kinds of politics. Interesting thing is when they first came here, the first place they wanted to go, they wanted to go out to Ferguson, Missouri. It was Ferguson, Missouri was still having the demonstrations. They went out to Ferguson and they say, oh, this is just like at home. People shooting that tear gas and the police out there beating up on folks. They felt right at home. So we have a generation of young people who are pushing some of these negative leaders out. And they need our support. It's not going to happen overnight. So this new generation of Pan-Africanism, I think, is really emerging, but there's not going to be like an overpowering. It's not going to be a big, like Kwame Nkrumah or Patrice Lumumba or Sekou Touré or these guys. It's going to be more of a movement of a lot of people on the ground level who are pushing things out, and I think that's going to be even better because they're closer to the ground. They're going to be more accountable to the people, and so right now you have some really strong movements developing in Central Africa, West Africa, East Africa as well. I mean, you look at Bobby Wine and stuff he's doing out there in Uganda. He's got the youth working with him. Look at down there in again, I keep mentioning South Africa because the youth are doing so much, and so it's really happening all over. But it has to be consolidated.
Yeah.
The key is we got to get Liberia on the map, yeah, because Liberia is central in connecting, the French countries with the English-speaking, the French-speaking countries with the English-speaking countries, and connecting at least the U.S. and the Caribbean diaspora with the African diaspora.
And that's our attempt we do here on Focus on Liberia. We hope we get all the support. But let's talk about this last thing on the relationship where Africans or African immigrants see African Americans, in a certain way and vice versa. Mm-hmm. Where did that come from, and how do we bridge the gap? There are now a couple of videos on YouTube, mm-hmm, stating that addressing that issue, that Africans, they are calling us Akata, and they are calling us lazy, and all kinds of misconception. Mm-hmm. Where do these come from, and how do we address them to bridge that gap?
Yeah, well, these things are, I shouldn't say normal or natural, but these things are the sorts of things that happen when groups of people come together that aren't familiar with each other. So if you had come into this country, let's say 50 years ago, in a community full of Irish, Italians, and Jews, they would all be, they would live in the same neighborhood, and they would have names for each other, and they would have competition with each other, and they would have gang fights with each other, and that sort of thing. I'm not trying to downplay it, but what I'm saying is that this is something that is going to occur, and what we have to do is come up with a planned approach for dealing with it. To deal with that European ethnic thing, they displaced some of their anger toward each other onto us, and but that's not something that we necessarily want to do. But they also developed institutions that were designed to bring them together in the urban areas, and they had things such as what they call settlement houses, And the settlement houses were places where people from these different ethnic groups could come together, and they could, engage in sports and study and do things together. So we need to be intentional in terms of how we do some things. So for instance, we need to be intentional in having our religious institutions worship together, maybe, or come together and just have these kind of dialogue in the same room, and so forth. We need to do joint cultural programming, and we need to party together. I used to be the advisor to the African American students at one university, and I was also at the same time advisor to the Nigerian students. And we didn't have a African student union, but we had a Nigerian student union. So they kind of became they did that job, and so we had this kind of rough relationship. So what I did was I said, look, let's get some money. I told him rent a couple of rooms at a hotel. I got him a DJ. This was a DJ who could play, he knew all the music, soul music, at that time, soul music, reggae, and Afro, what was Afro pop, stuff from the continent. And I said, go in there and see who can out party the other one. And say, here people went in, they had not been getting along. And they went in and partied, they danced, and they tried out each other's dances. I said, y'all cook some food. I said, cook some food. And all those African-American kids out came, they still cook jollof rice today from that experience, from learning how to cook African food, and so we need to, when we were on the plant, going back to when we were on the plantation, and we were trying to figure out where people were. We'd say, what dance do you do? And people would do different dances on those plantations. This is how we, and the dance that kind of everybody did, that was familiar to everybody, that became the dance of that plantation. So dancing, the parties unified us. We go down there and get one of them hogs, or get one of those, take one of those cows from the old master and take it down the woods and kill him, have a, barbecue him, cook him up real good, and have a party way late at night while he's still asleep. And that's how we unified ourselves. We need to do some of those things as well, not just this, political and, education, do all that too. But we need to get together and find, because we all love to dance, we all love to good music, and we can share something. We all like to eat, so we share our food, share our, dances, share our music. I think that's going to help, and we have to set aside certain times to do it. We have to be intentional about it. So at some point during Black History Day has to be Black or All Africa Community Day, where we bring all the Africans from wherever they are in that town and have a big bash. And same thing for doing, Kawans and so forth, have a big bash or big something where we all come together in one place and celebrate each other. And we also to argue with each other, and you have our rules for argument, but argue with each other so we get to know each other. We get to know each other also through arguing and find out what people really think. So these are, it's going through these negative things is going to push us forward. And I have no doubt in my mind at all, not one doubt in my mind, that we're going to come out of this process as a new, strong people that are unified in outlook and unified in institution building and in the economy. As the brother was saying, we have to build that process. Now, one of the problems that we have, African Americans, we had developed that process and we kind of let it go. So we used to have that economic process where we kept the money in our community for a certain amount of time for it to escape. But so for us to do that with someone for the continent is difficult because we have lost some of that tradition ourselves here. And so these are things that we have to really be intentional about and keep working on them until we actually make them happen. But we know they can happen because they are happening, and they are happening in various places, and we need to make them happen more. The very fact that our brother has put on this program, Brother Josh put this has this program available and has this out here and available on all forms of social media and so forth, means that it's happening. Right now, the conditions exist for Pan-Africanism in a way it has never existed before. We are everywhere. When I say everywhere, we're everywhere on the planet Earth. We are there, and we're there in considerable numbers. We're in the places that dominate the world in considerable numbers, and we're in the places that are dominated by the world in considerable numbers. Yeah. We're only lacking two things. We don't have the ideological sense that we are one people and that we need to work together all around the world, and that what hurts one hurts all, and what helps one helps all, and that we be willing to struggle in the U.S., Britain, France, or wherever, in order to help our people. Also have the sense that Africa is the core of whatever we have to do. So we want to try to build Africa. We want to try to turn the dollars around. So instead of the dollars and francs and leaving Africa, they're coming back. In the CFA area, the people getting rid of that CFA franc, they move into a new currency. That's a sign of something that's good and it's about to happen.
Great. Well, Dr. Holmes, thank you so much, first of all, for accepting our call to be here. We will be glad to have you back anytime to talk on anything, because you are worth of knowledge. Before we close the broadcast, we want to just get your final thoughts.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much. I think this is a very important, excellent platform and an excellent thing that you're doing. I just want to, just comment in terms of what Kwame Nkrumah said. Now, he said Africa is the home of he was talking about the black people in America at that time. He said for the black, he said man, but we say man and woman today. For the black man and woman in America, Africa is your home. You're part of the African nation, because without Africa, you don't have a home. Yeah. We've been here 400 years. It's not, we're not, you don't shoot people down the street that's in your home. Yeah. So we have to do that. We just, a lot of times we don't want to feel as if somebody's going to, we are people who don't like to be turned down. We're afraid of not being accepted by our own people. So this makes us a little hesitant sometimes. But these are some of the things that we have to do. And we, again, I think this is an excellent program. It's got me energized to do some things more that I need to do to get rolling. And I think really, when we look at that history of Liberia, and its history has been and continues to be a history that's grappling with all of the essential questions of Pan-Africanism, not just the question of the diaspora, relations of the diaspora to people who are at home, but also the relationship between the different indigenous ethnic groups, and the relationship between our partners, our other countries in the region, and our relationships to the non-African world. Yeah. It's a microcosm of that whole experience in Liberia has had many successes and many failures. We have to learn and build on the successes, and we have to learn and stop the failures and and move in another directions away from the failures. So you know, I'm expecting, you know, when I talk to some of the young Liberians who have grown up here, who've come here since, you know, since the Civil War in particular, or since the 80s, you know, I get a real sense of young people who want to do something for their home. Many of them haven't even seen that home, and they just haven't figured it out. What's that going to be? But those young folks in that the young people in that third diaspora, that most recent African diaspora, they are really the link between the other two, between the old traditional African American diaspora, because they go into school with those folks. They speak that same, you know, that same lingo, that same slang. They listen to the same music, much of it.
Have the same chat
So they're really the link.
Yeah.
In terms of making this thing happen.
Dr. Holmes, before I let you go, we have, talking about tradition, we have some traditions or beliefs that even though sometimes you try not to believe it, but it still impacts you. For instance, if your hands are itching, it means you're going to get money.
Yep.
If you're going somewhere, you stump your toe, if that is the left foot, it's bad luck. If that's the right foot, it's good luck. What are some of those traditions that you came with from Africa 400 years ago and you still believe?
Well, that thing about the hand itching mean money. That's that's one of them. You know, that's one that's one of those ones that we still hold on to. And there's some others as well. And I don't even remember all of them, but if there's another, it's in, if you hear somebody's talking about you and
your ears ring a bell, someone is talking about you. Or
so,
if you sneeze.
So it's a lot of them, and even, you know, we had some people. I had some relatives in my family who had some gifts, I guess you might say. And if somebody was going to die, they knew it, because they would hear what they call death bells ringing. And when those death bells would ring, they knew. They would call around and say, "Hey, somebody's about to die," and next thing you knew, somebody died. And even you know, we even had some people who did certain roots things, you know, herbs, different things, and they would you know, they had certain ways of dealing with problems in the community. By basically using psychology and a mixture of psychology in those herbs.
And those bone specialists, if you had a sprained ankle, you're going to massage it, and then it works. Yeah, but thank you so much.
Even my grandfather, not my dad, but my grandfather, Papa, we used to call him. He didn't brush his teeth with a toothbrush.
All right.
He used to go in the woods, in a certain tree that he used to use to clean his teeth with.
Yeah.
And then he would pick that thing, and that's how he cleaned his chew. He had a chew stick.
Yeah.
And he had the prettiest white teeth, prettiest white straight teeth that you ever could see.
Yeah.
And so he would he had, you know, so some of those things, I didn't know what he was doing till later on. I saw people walk around, you know, chewing those sticks.
Yeah.
And they used to sell them over here too. You could, some place you can buy them here, you know. But that's what he did. And so, you know, even things like when we had killing, you know, we kill, you know, the people who kill the hogs and kill the animals, they slaughter them certain types of ways. You know, and when we had what we call hog killing time, everybody, all the women would come around and they would get together and everybody would work and everybody got a piece of the meat and you know, you didn't have, nobody paid for that stuff. And you know, everybody got something. You had fresh meat, and we all, because again, that was family. Where I grew up, I have an older cousin, and he said, "Don't you know that when you grew up, you can go 5 miles in that, everywhere in 5 miles in that direction, that was all family and all family land, and 3 miles in that direction, that was all family. Now, I had never thought about it.
Yeah.
We had, you know, you could go in so much. We could go through the woods. I grew up in the country, and all around, that was all family,
Yeah.
you know. And so we felt very secure in a certain kind of way, and appreciated and loved, and it's a feeling that's difficult to have, I think, in today's type of society, today's setup, where you don't really always know your neighbors and all that stuff.
Yeah, and we appreciate your time here. We appreciate also Lukwesa, who had to leave early. Let's as we close, let's end with this music from Sierra Leone and get some of the beat from the motherland. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is how we want to end the broadcast tonight. I want to say thank you so much for being here. I want to thank Dr. Holmes and also the Queen of AU, Ms. Lukwesa Morin, for being our guest tonight. Thanks to all those who posted questions, who call in. On behalf of my guest relations manager, Stephanie Setro, my co-host, Danielle knuckles-guishard, my name is Dennis Jar, wishing you good night and God bless you.